have been cutting and cutting and cutting my intervention because it's too late. But I will tell you that most of the ideas that I can share with you are not really a consequence of my studies as an academic, but even also, of course, a result of those studies, but basically they are a consequence of my vivid experience through my life as a journalist. In that period of my life, during almost 20 years, I covered particularly the African and Middle East issues. And therefore, I have a vivid experience of the costs of war. Because I covered, for instance, the Angolan war, Mozambique war, Lebanon war, and Iraq war, part of it. I also, this is not part of my intervention, I just try to tell you what I have been vividly experienced. I also had the opportunity to interview some of the leaders that were mentioned here. I interviewed President Mandela and some of the Middle East presidents, for instance, Saddam Hussein, 3 times. One time in Havana, when he was taken the presidency of the non-aligned movement. That meeting in Havana was in 1979, yeah? And 2 times in Baghdad. President Arafat, for instance, 3 times too. One in the very difficult conditions in Lebanon when he was threatened by the Israeli invasion in 1982. I was there when Beirut was bombed by Sharon. And the final consequence, we know, that was the PLO expelled from Lebanon and obliged to go to Tunis. So I had here some ideas, but I will take directly to those that I think that are the main reflections, the main ideas that I can share with you. And this is directly related to the title that I gave to my intervention, Can the Bandung Spirit help to propose alternatives to the present chaos? I will not take this part of my speech because I think those who have spoken before have already mentioned what I have written here, and I will take directly those pages about the Bandung conference that I think that will be perhaps my main contribution. Why to think on Bandung nowadays? Well, first of all, we have all heard from many of my colleagues that the change, the political change, cannot be imposed from the outside by an outside power, much less by means of gunfire. When I referred to the present situation in Middle East to my students, I used to compare that experience with the one we used to have in Latin America during the dictatorships. I asked them, in the period of dictatorship, most of my students, of course, didn't have the personal experience of the dictatorship, but their fathers, mothers, their families perhaps have spoken with them about that period. So I asked them, would you prefer to have a short end of that very tragic period of our life through an American invasion that took out the military regime? Of course, the answer is, of course, not. Well, I say, that is what happens in the Middle East. In the name of humanitarian intervention, an external power takes the place of the government. In the case of Iraq, for instance, dissolves the army, nominates the government, and decided the future of the country in the size they understand that it might to be. In Latin America, of course, we didn't have this experience, even though the dictatorship was as much a very tragic experience as perhaps those in the Middle East. And those dictators have the support of the United States, even in the moment of the coup d'etat. So, what is important for me to think about Bandung, the conference that takes place in April 1955 in Indonesia? Being challenged, so in our time, to propose alternatives to the present cause, it is wise to remember that conference and what is its legacy. Because that was the moment that brought together leaders from some 30 African and Asian nations, responsible for the destiny of more than 1 million human beings, and many of the problems that were analyzed by them in that pioneering conference continue to challenge a huge part of humanity. This observation invites us to think about the relevance today of some of the assessments and proposals made at the event, which constituted a landmark in the history of 20th century international relations. By consecrating the emergence of the non-aligned movement and the concept of the third world, the Bandung meeting represented symbolically the moment in which a significant sector of humanity became aware of its role and made its voice heard. Richard Wright, an African-American writer and journalist, wrote The Color Curtain, a report on the Bandung Conference after attending the meeting. In it, he wrote, "The despised, the insulted, the hurt, the dispossessed, in short, the underdogs of the human race were meeting. Who had thought of organizing such a meeting? And what had these nations in common? Nothing, it seemed to me, but what their past relationship to the Western world had made them feel. this meeting of the rejected was in itself a kind of judgment upon the Western world. It was true that there were differences among the participants, but guided by the ideal of creating a space of their own, an imagined community, in the bipolar world of that period, this group of nations identified 10 principles which guided their action in favor of promotion of a peaceful coexistence. And through these principles, the spirit of Bandung marked the process of liberation from the colonial world and determined the path for the international insertion of the countries that formed the non-aligned movement with an explicit condemnation of racism, colonialism, and imperialism. The 10 principles for peace were based on the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence as defined in the declaration signed by India and China with the presence of Myanmar in 1954 in order to overcome their differences and focus on the defense of sovereignty and peace, non-aggression, and non-interference in the internal affairs of other countries. These are the 10 principles of Bandung. Respect for fundamental human rights and for the purpose and principles of the Charter of the United Nations. Respect for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of all nations. Recognition of equality among all races and equality among all nations. Non-intervention and non-interference in the internal affairs of other countries. Respect for the right of every nation to defend itself. Non-use of collective defense pact to benefit the specific interests of any of the great powers. Refraining from acts of threats of aggression. Settlement of all international disputes by peaceful means such as negotiation, conciliation, arbitration, or judicial settlement, as well as other peaceful means of the parties' own choice in conformity with the Charter of the United Nations, promotion of mutual interest and cooperation, respect for justice and international obligations. I think that it's important to understand that those nations who were direct victims of imperialism, colonialism, all what we have been talking about in this session, do trust on the international law to be the way to overcome future problems. They do not ask for a revenge or some way of retribution of what they were taken off from them, but they ask only and simply for the respect of the international law. This is a very profound, for me, example of what we are looking for in this meeting. The question that Professor Fred asked us to answer or try to answer. Because we are as accustomed to be international law put as it was not anymore a reference, that we don't even think on the possibility of turning this, our point, our compass in our way to overcome the present problems. So, I ask you, do we need any further at present to create alternatives to the present chaos? I think not. Non-intervention, respect for international law, seeking peaceful and negotiated solutions to conflict. Such a scenario, it seems so very remote. However, with political will and with a good mobilization of public opinion, as it was mentioned here by other speakers, it would be far more accessible. The issue of public opinion leads to other proposals made by the non-aligned countries, which should be revisited, adapting them to the current situation. In the 70s, with their geopolitical importance rising, the non-aligned countries adopted two new priority areas for their demands: the implementation of a new international economic order and a new world information and communication order. The latter was incorporated by UNESCO, which in 1977 set up an international commission to study the problems of the information flow. 3 years later, the commission released a paper known as the McBride Report, after Son McBride, who chaired the commission, with concrete proposals seeking a balance between the developed countries and the third world regarding the production of the huge international, the production of and access to information, together with a condemnation of a huge international information monopolies. The reaction of the United States and the United Kingdom was drastic. Both countries abandoned UNESCO and cut off their funding for this UN agency, which faced years of crisis and was finally forced to set aside any discussion on the issue. Directly related to the proposal for a profound change in the rules of the game in the economic system and in the production and distribution of information at world level, the non-aligned group questioned the division of the world according to the Cold War rationale, it was mentioned, based on ideological options, and they identified the real division as being based on the unequal capacity of nations to dispose of their own natural resources. For the non-aligned countries, the economy and the communications were strategic areas through which to achieve the central goal, the full development of every country. Ambitious development goals were seen as the only way to eliminate exploitation and domination of all kinds. Although much of the analysis made by the non-aligned movement was correct, the power balance of that historical moment did not allow for the implementation of those alternatives. The movement itself lost momentum in the face of the economic and political impasse and took on a lower profile on the international scene. Nevertheless, in the last decades, we have seen the BRICS as somehow they are taking some of these ideas into practice, for instance, with the proposal of an alternative for the Bretton Woods architecture with the bank which is being created. New situations, new possibilities to develop such ideas. Well, just because I have no much time, I will finish with what I think it would be an answer or partial answer to what we have to discuss in this session. With the Bandung inspiration, as a form of taken direction to our present actions, I think that we have to go again to rethink, to rebuild, and to put into practice that old banners of respect of the sovereignty and territorial integrity of all nations. And I think I have no chance to develop this idea. I agree completely with Professor Galton when he said that the states, particularly in Africa and in the Middle East, are results of the Sykes-Picot agreement. And of course, that means that were created in the sense of a best way for France and Great Britain to exploit them, not really as a result of their own historical background. Anyhow, the non-aligned movement, and that is also for Africa very important, it is a decision that those frontiers have to be respected because they are the only, in short time, the only form of political coexistence. And if there are going to be changed, there must be changed in conformity with what their people decided, not from, at least the case today, for instance, with Iraq or with Syria, as a consequence of external intervention. It might be respected the historical processes, even to rethink their frontiers. So, respect for the sovereignty and territorial integrity, recognition of equality of all races and equality among all nations, non-intervention, no interference, I think continues to provide a good compass as we undertake this journey. But will it be possible to defend these goals in a world in such turmoil as we are? It seems unrealistic. However, I am convinced that these are the goals that should guide our action. In the short term, we need to be guided by them in order to avoid new conflicts. And it is also necessary to begin to do away gradually with the causes of existing conflicts. Terrorists feed upon the frustration generated by the non-resolution of conflicts. As frustrations grow, so do the number of their followers. An excellent starting point would be to make up our minds once and for all to find a genuine solution for the Palestine issue. If we were able to eliminate the Palestinian problem by means of a fair solution, we would be dismantling one of the most perverse and persistent sources of conflict and suffering in the Middle East. Let us continue to search for a diplomatic, negotiated solution to the Syrian problem. Let us review the issue of the debt and fight for alternatives to the austerity policies. We shall thus be taking significant steps to overcome the frustration of millions of young people throughout the world and relieve the pressure on African societies in particular. Let us move forward in setting up controls for tax havens and in seeking greater transparency for financial transactions. In this way, we shall be cutting off corruption at its roots and making it possible to detect many of the clandestine world sources of funding. We heard in the morning Chairman Yakunin speaking on this, on his not believer that it is impossible to search for the funding of ISIS and or other terrorist groups. And above all, let us endeavor to multiply the forms of the media commitment to all of these goals. Wars feed on the lack of information and misinformation. Well-informed public opinion will be our best ally in the fight for a peaceful world. Thank you.